27th May, 1942. Gazala Line, Western Desert, Libya. In the pre-dawn darkness, a gun commander of the Royal Artillery crouched behind a low shield, his range card marked in pencil. 600 yards, 800 yards, 1,000 yards. The 2-pounder guns that had fought through 1941 were gone now, replaced by something new. Stenciled crates from Woolwich Arsenal had arrived weeks earlier, marked QF6PDR, across no man's land. Panzer commanders expected another routine breakthrough. Their intelligence summaries showed no new British weapons in quantity. The morning's first radio intercepts were confident. Opposition would collapse as before. But when the sun rose and the first German armor rolled forward, something fundamental had changed. For the first time in the North African campaign, British anti-tank crews could kill at the ranges where they themselves could survive. February through June, 1941. Tobruk perimeter and the Cyrenaican approaches. An officer of the 1st Army Tank Brigade stood behind a 40mm gun, the British 2-pounder, and watched German tanks advance beyond effective range. His sights were calibrated, his crew well-trained, but the mathematics were unforgiving. At 800 yards, a solid shot from the 2-pounder struck frontal armor and bounced away, leaving bright scars but no penetrations. The War Office had rated this weapon sufficient against known enemy types in 1939. By mid-1941, reality in the desert told a different story. The Panzer III had arrived in North Africa with 50mm of frontal armor. The Panzer IV, though fewer in number, mounted a 7.5cm gun and heavier plating. British crews found themselves in a lethal equation. German tanks could engage and destroy at 1,000 to 1,200 yards, while the 2-pounder required closing to 600 yards or less for reliable kills. After-action reports from Operation Battleaxe in June 1941 documented the pattern. One passage, filed by an artillery officer, read, "Enemy tanks engaged at 800 yards. No penetrations observed. The crew was forced to displace under fire. The 2-pounder had a second, fatal flaw. It possessed no high-explosive shell. Designed purely as an anti-tank weapon, it could not suppress German anti-tank guns or attack unarmored vehicles effectively. In the fluid battles of the Western Desert, where 88mm flak guns were used in direct fire against British armor, the inability to return counter-battery fire left gun crews helpless. German doctrine called for Panzers to pin British tanks while 88mm guns, firing from beyond 1,500 yards, systematically destroyed them. British 2-pounders, lacking both range and high-explosive rounds, could neither kill the tanks nor silence the guns. By mid-1941, lost statistics told the story in cold numbers. A majority of British tank casualties occurred at ranges beyond the 2-pounder's penetration envelope. Crews were being killed before they could return effective fire. The Ministry of Supply and the Ordnance Board had known since 1940 that a replacement was necessary. A 57mm design, the 6-pounder, had been ready in prototype. But events in France had intervened, and the weapon that might have changed the Desert War sat in storage, awaiting production that kept being delayed. The men who served the 2-pounders understood their predicament with bitter clarity. One gunner, in a letter home preserved in regimental archives, wrote, "We can see them and we can hit them, but we cannot hurt them. They stand off and pick us apart." The contrast between the weapon's peacetime promise and its wartime performance was stark. The 2-pounder had been conceived for a different war, against lighter tanks at closer ranges. North Africa, with its open terrain and improved German armor, had rendered it obsolete. The gun crews did their duty, but they did so knowing that their weapon was inadequate. The statistical imbalance, effective range versus survival range, demanded a solution. That solution existed, but it had not yet reached the front. 1940 through 1941. Woolwich Arsenal and the Vickers Drawing Offices, England. The 57mm anti-tank gun, officially designated the Ordnance QF 6-pounder 700 weight, had been designed and tested before the fall of France. Engineers at Vickers had produced a complete set of technical drawings. The gun featured a semi-automatic vertical sliding breech, a hydrospring recoil system, and a carriage that balanced traverse and stability. Penetration trials showed it could defeat 60 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards with standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap shot. It was, by any measure, the weapon the British Army needed. But in May and June of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had lost nearly all its equipment in the evacuation from Dunkirk. Hundreds of guns, thousands of vehicles, and entire divisions' worth of stores had been abandoned on the beaches and in the ports of France. The immediate crisis was not modernization but reconstitution. The factories that might have begun production of the 6-pounder were ordered instead to continue manufacturing the 2-pounder. The existing design, the existing tooling, the existing supply chains, all were directed toward replacing what had been lost. Strategic necessity postponed capability. A Ministry of Supply memorandum from early 1941, preserved in the National Archives, laid out the calculus. The 2-pounder was in production, with established suppliers and proven manufacturing processes. Switching to the 6-pounder would require retooling, retraining workers, and establishing new supply chains for ammunition and spare parts. In the short term, quantity took precedence over quality. The Army would fight with the weapons it could produce quickly, not the weapons it needed for the long war ahead. The 6-pounder blueprints were rolled, indexed, and stored. Development was listed as complete. Production was deferred, pending emergency rearmament. The cost of this decision would be measured in men and machines. Through 1941, British forces in North Africa fought two major campaigns, Operation Compass and Operation Battleaxe, with the 2-pounder as their primary anti-tank weapon. Crews learned to compensate with tactics. Ambush from close range, dig in to reduce silhouette, displace rapidly after firing. But tactics could not change physics. The 6-pounder, sitting in storage, could penetrate what the 2-pounder could not. The officers who studied after-action reports understood this. The men who served the guns in the desert understood it even more clearly. By late 1941, the emergency rearmament was complete, and production priorities began to shift. The first 6-pounders rolled off assembly lines in December 1941. Acceptance trials confirmed their performance. But the path from factory to battlefield was long. Guns had to be shipped to the Middle East, distributed to units, and integrated into defensive plans. Training had to be conducted, ammunition stockpiled, tactics revised. The 6-pounder would not arrive in time for the Crusader Offensive of November 1941. It would barely arrive in time for the defensive battle that would define its reputation. When the first consignments finally reached Suez in early 1942, British crews examined them with professional interest. The gun was heavier than the 2-pounder, but still light enough for a crew of 6 to manhandle into position. The breech opened and closed with smooth precision. The sights were calibrated for longer ranges. Test firings at acceptance ranges near Alexandria left clean, circular perforations in the armor plate. For the first time since the North African campaign began, British anti-tank gunners possessed a weapon that matched their opponent's armor. The Desert War had been fought for 2 years without this gun. Now it had arrived, and both sides would learn what difference it made. January through April 1942, Port Suez, Alexandria, and forward supply dumps near Mersa Matruh. Wooden crates stenciled QF6PDR came ashore from transport ships, hoisted by dockside cranes onto Chevrolet 30-hundredweight lorries. Ordnance officers signed for them, checked serial numbers, and dispatched them forward along the coastal road. At acceptance firing ranges, crews test-fired each gun, verifying zero and function. The results were consistent. At 1,000 yards, armor-piercing capped ballistic cap shot punched through test plates that would have deflected 2-pounder rounds. This was the weapon that had been needed since 1941. Middle East Command began allocating the 6-pounders to anti-tank regiments across 8th Army. The guns were distributed not as a wholesale replacement. 2-pounders remained in service, but as a reinforcement to defensive positions. Doctrine called for anti-tank guns to be emplaced in mutually supporting boxes, fortified positions that could break up armored attacks. The 6-pounder, with its longer reach, allowed these boxes to engage at greater depth. Firing positions were surveyed, range cards drawn, and ammunition stocked. Each gun received a basic load of armor-piercing rounds, with additional stocks held at battery level. German intelligence, monitoring British radio traffic and interrogating prisoners, noted the arrival of a new weapon but did not initially grasp its significance. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights photographed supply dumps but could not distinguish 6-pounders from 2-pounders in overhead imagery. Panzer Army Africa's intelligence summaries in early 1942 made passing reference to a new British anti-tank gun, but did not adjust operational planning. The assumption, based on 2 years of experience, was that British anti-tank defenses would be suppressed by a combination of artillery preparation, tank rushes, and 88mm guns firing from standoff range. This assumption was about to be tested. The 6-pounder was also being mounted in tanks. Valentine 9 and Churchill 3 models began receiving the gun in early 1942, providing a mobile platform. The combination of towed and tank-mounted 6-pounders gave British commanders flexibility. Static guns for defensive belts, mobile guns for counterattacks or pursuit. Ammunition scales were established: 60 rounds per towed gun, 40 rounds per tank, and supply columns practiced the logistics of keeping guns fed. Training emphasized rapid engagement. Identify, range, fire, adjust, fire again. The semi-automatic breech allowed a well-drilled crew to maintain 8 to 10 rounds per minute in sustained fire. The Gazala line, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to Bur Hakim in the deep desert, became the testing ground. 8th Army engineers dug gun pits to shelter the 6-pounders, positioned them to create overlapping fields of fire, and camouflaged them with salvaged materials and desert scrub. Ammunition was stocked in slit trenches nearby. Field telephone lines connected guns to battery command posts. Crews rehearsed engagement drills and displacement procedures. By late May 1942, the preparations were complete. The 6-pounders were in position, crews trained, ammunition ready. Across no man's land, Rommel's Panzer Army Africa was preparing its next offensive. The operational plan called for a sweeping flanking maneuver around the southern end of the Gazala line, followed by a drive north to encircle British forces. Panzer regiments expected to encounter the usual British defenses: 2-pounder anti-tank guns, cruiser tanks with 2-pounders or 6-pounders, not yet recognized in strength, and 88mm guns in limited numbers. The plan assumed that German armor, supported by dive bombers and artillery, would break through in a matter of days. What the plan did not account for was a defensive belt armed with a gun that could kill at range. On the morning of May 27, 1942, that oversight would begin to exact a cost. 27th May through 6 June, 1942. The Knightsbridge sector and the approaches to Bur Hakim. In the pre-dawn darkness, a British gun commander crouched behind his 6-pounder, field telephone in hand. The gun sat low in its pit, shielded by a thin wall of rocks and camouflaged with torn sandbags and camel thorn scrub. At first light, the sound of engines reached the position. Deep, growling diesel notes and the clatter of tracks on stone. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, advancing in formation, confident in their tactical superiority. The gun commander called corrections over the field telephone, confirming range and target priority with his battery commander. Then, with the targets closing to 1,000 yards, he gave the order to fire. The 6-pounder's first shot in combat struck a Panzer III in the frontal glacis. The armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round punched through 50mm of face-hardened steel, detonated inside the fighting compartment, and killed or wounded the crew. The tank rolled to a halt, smoke rising from hatches. Other guns in the belt opened fire, engaging at ranges that would have been suicidal with 2-pounders. German tank commanders, accustomed to standing off beyond British effective range, found themselves taking penetrating hits before they had identified the firing positions. Panzer crews began reporting casualties at ranges they had considered safe. The Afrika Korps War Diary for May 27 recorded the first day's losses with evident surprise. 15 Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division both reported unexpectedly high casualties from ground fire, and noted that suppression of British anti-tank guns was proving more difficult than anticipated. Tank commanders called for 88mm flak guns to be brought forward, the standard German solution for enemy anti-tank belts. But the request revealed the shift in tactical dynamics. For the first time in the Western Desert, German armor was being forced onto the defensive by British guns. The engagement at Gazala was not a clean, decisive victory for either side. Rommel's forces succeeded in their flanking maneuver, encircled British positions, and eventually forced a withdrawal. But the cost was higher than expected, and the tempo was slower. Where Panzer regiments had anticipated quick breakthroughs, they encountered sustained resistance. The 6-pounder could not stop the offensive, but it could blunt it, delay it, and exact losses that would matter in subsequent fighting. British defensive boxes, armed with the new gun, forced German armor to call for artillery support, deploy smoke, and maneuver carefully. The battles were still German victories, but they were no longer easy victories. One German tank commander, in a post-battle report captured later in the war, wrote, "The British anti-tank guns opened fire at ranges where we expected safety. Several tanks were lost before we could locate the firing positions. Suppression required heavy expenditure of high explosive and smoke. The language was clinical, but the meaning was clear. The tactical equation had changed." British crews, for their part, recorded the engagement with professional satisfaction. One battery commander's log noted, 6-pounders engaged at 800 to 1,000 yards with multiple observed kills. Crews maintained discipline and displaced per plan. The gun had been tested in combat, and it had performed. The Gazala battles of late May and early June 1942 established the 6-pounder's reputation. It could kill German tanks at combat ranges. It could survive long enough to fire multiple engagements. It forced German commanders to adjust their tactics and accept higher casualties. The gun was not a miracle weapon. British forces still withdrew from Gazala, still lost Tobruk, still fell back to El Alamein, but it was a capable weapon in the hands of trained crews. For the first time since 1940, British anti-tank gunners possessed a tool that let them fight on equal terms. Early 1942 trials with doctrine notes circulated mid-year. Lulworth Proving Ground, England and Middle East acceptance ranges. A breech opened and snapped shut, the vertical sliding block moving with oiled precision. The recoil system, a hydrospring design, cycled smoothly as the gun fired, the barrel returning to battery without disturbing the aim. A stopwatch clicked as a crew demonstrated practical rates of fire. 6 aimed rounds in the first minute, then a sustained 8 to 10 rounds per minute as the rhythm settled. Ordnance Board observers recorded the results, comparing them against German anti-tank guns and finding the 6-pounder equal or superior in key metrics. The gun's performance began with its ammunition. The standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round massed 6.28 pounds and left the muzzle at 2,693 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it retained enough energy to penetrate 74 millimeters of homogeneous armor at 30 degrees obliquity. This meant the 6-pounder could defeat the frontal armor of the Panzer III and the side armor of the Panzer IV at typical combat ranges. Against the Panzer III, which mounted 50 millimeters of frontal armor, the 6-pounder held penetration capability out to 1,200 yards. Against the Panzer IV, side shots were lethal at even longer ranges. Accuracy trials showed the gun's precision. Firing from a dug-in position at 500 yards, a trained crew could place 5 shots inside a 2-foot circle. At 1,000 yards, the group opened to 4 feet, still tight enough for reliable hits on a tank-sized target. The hydrospring recoil system played a key role in this accuracy. Unlike guns with friction-based recoil mechanisms, the 6-pounder's hydraulic damping absorbed the recoil impulse smoothly, allowing the gun to return to battery with minimal disturbance. Crews could fire, observe the strike, make a small correction, and fire again without losing their sight picture. The gun's silhouette was another tactical advantage. Dug into a pit to regulation depth, approximately 3.6 feet, the 6-pounder presented the lowest profile of any towed anti-tank gun in the Western Desert. German observers, scanning the horizon for targets, often failed to spot the guns until after they had fired. British doctrine emphasized this advantage. Dig deep, camouflage thoroughly, and fire only when the target was within certain kill range. The combination of low silhouette and long reach meant that 6-pounder crews could engage German tanks while remaining difficult to locate and suppress. Training standards adapted to the gun's capabilities. Crews practiced engaging moving targets, leading the aim to account for target speed and range. They rehearsed displacement drills. Fire a short engagement, displace to an alternate position before German artillery could respond, and prepare to engage again. They learned to judge range by eye, using landmarks and terrain features to estimate distance before firing. Gunnery instructors emphasized the principle of first-round hits. With proper training and a good sight picture, the 6-pounder could kill on the first shot, before the enemy could react. The engineering package translated directly into tactical effects. A gun that could fire faster allowed more engagements per minute. A gun that recoiled smoothly allowed rapid corrections and follow-up shots. A gun that sat low in its pit survived longer under counter-battery fire. A gun that penetrated at range kept its crew out of the enemy's most effective killing zone. Every technical feature had a human consequence. The Ordnance Board's test reports, dense with figures and tables, described a weapon that gave British crews a measurable advantage in survivability and lethality. In the field, that advantage translated into confidence, the knowledge that when the 6-pounder fired, it could kill. June 1942, Tobruk approaches and Panzer Army Africa headquarters at Derna. Erwin Rommel, commander of Axis forces in North Africa, studied after-action reports and loss tallies from the Gazala fighting. The numbers were troubling. Panzer losses to British anti-tank guns had been higher than anticipated, and the pattern was consistent. Frontal penetrations at ranges previously considered safe. German tank commanders reported being engaged at 800 to 1,000 yards by a weapon that had not appeared in previous intelligence estimates. Rommel's staff identified the new threat as the British 57mm gun and began issuing tactical guidance to counter it. The first adjustment was procedural. Panzer regiments received orders to avoid direct frontal approaches against known or suspected British anti-tank belts. Instead, attacks were to be supported by smoke screens, delivered by artillery or mortar, to obscure the gunner's aim. Tanks were to advance by bounds, using terrain features for cover, rather than in massed formations across open ground. The goal was to reduce exposure time and deny British crews clear shots at range. These were standard suppression tactics, but their application against British guns marked a shift. German armor was now maneuvering defensively against an opponent it had previously overmatched. The second adjustment was to bring forward the 88mm flak gun in greater numbers. The 88, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, had proven devastatingly effective in direct fire against ground targets. Its high-velocity shell could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, and it could engage towed anti-tank guns from beyond their effective reach. Rommel ordered that 88s be integrated into Panzer regiment operations, positioned on the flanks of advances to provide overwatch and suppression. The guns were to engage British anti-tank belts with high-explosive shells, forcing crews to take cover or displace, while Panzers maneuvered into assault positions. A captured German directive, seized during later fighting, outlined the new approach in explicit terms. The British 57mm gun is not to be engaged by tanks at ranges under 1,000 meters without prior suppression. Employment of smoke and heavy weapons is required before advance. Direct assault without preparation will result in unnecessary losses. The language was measured, but the implication was clear. The 6-pounder had altered the tactical calculus. German commanders, who had grown accustomed to rapid breakthroughs supported by superior firepower, now had to plan more carefully and move more cautiously. The British, monitoring German radio traffic and interrogating prisoners, noted the changes. Intelligence summaries reported increased use of smoke, more deliberate maneuvers, and heavier preliminary bombardments. 8th Army staff interpreted this as validation of the 6-pounder's effectiveness. The gun had not stopped Rommel's advance. Tobruk fell in June 1942, and British forces withdrew to the El Alamein line, but it had imposed costs in time, ammunition, and casualties. Each delay, each diversion of 88s to anti-tank work, each cautious maneuver around a suspected gun belt contributed to the broader strategic picture. Diverting 88s to direct-fire anti-tank roles had its own cost for the Germans. These guns were needed for air defense, particularly against the Royal Air Force's increasing strikes on supply columns and rear areas. Every 88 pulled forward to suppress 6-pounders was one less gun protecting logistics from air attack. Rommel was forced to choose between protecting his advance and protecting his supply line, and the need to suppress British anti-tank guns tipped the balance toward the former. It was a subtle shift in the economy of force, but in a theater defined by logistics and supply, subtle shifts mattered. By mid-June 1942, the pattern was established. German armor would not charge British anti-tank belts without preparation. British gunners would exact losses if given the opportunity. The 6-pounder had not reversed the course of the campaign, but it had made the campaign more expensive for the attacker.
In var, expense matters.
Tanks lost at Gazala could not be replaced quickly. Crews killed in frontal assaults took months to train and rotate into theater. The 6-pounder was shaping the battlefield, even in retreat. Summer and autumn, 1942. Vickers factories, Royal Ordnance facilities across England, and United States Ordnance Department production lines. A quality control inspector ran a gauge through the bore of a newly manufactured gun, checking dimensions to ensure that ammunition would chamber correctly and that pressures would remain within safe limits. The 6-pounder was in mass production now, no longer constrained by the emergency priorities of 1940. Monthly output climbed as production lines refined their processes and suppliers delivered components on schedule. The gun that had been delayed for 2 years was now flowing to the field in significant numbers. British production reached a steady rhythm by mid-1942. Vickers and the Royal Ordnance factories produced approximately 400 guns per month, a figure that included both towed and tank-mounted variants. These guns were shipped to the Middle East to home forces defending Britain, and, under Lend-Lease agreements, to Soviet forces. The shipping priority to the Middle East remained high through the summer, as 8th Army rebuilt its strength for a renewed offensive. Crates of 6-pounders, marked with their serial numbers and packed with manuals and basic spare kits, traveled by convoy through the Mediterranean or around the Cape of Good Hope. The United States Army, observing the 6-pounder's performance, standardized the design as the 57mm gun M1. American factories began production in mid-1942, using drawings and specifications provided under Lend-Lease technical exchange agreements. The American version was virtually identical to the British original, with minor differences in manufacturing tolerances and materials. Critically, the ammunition was fully interchangeable. A British gun could fire American-made rounds and vice versa. This interoperability simplified logistics in theaters where British and American forces operated together. Ammunition production scaled alongside gun production. The standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, the primary anti-tank munition, was manufactured in British and American facilities. Production rates climbed into the millions of rounds per quarter by late 1942. High explosive and canister rounds, less common but tactically useful against soft targets and infantry, also entered production. Ammunition was packaged in wooden crates, typically 12 rounds per crate, and shipped forward with the guns. Resupply procedures were established. Batteries would draw from corps-level stocks, which in turn would be replenished from base depots. The standardization across Allied forces had strategic implications. British and American infantry anti-tank platoons could now share ammunition, spare parts, and even guns if necessary. Training could be conducted using common manuals and procedures. In the Mediterranean theater, where the First Army, a combined British-American force, prepared for the invasion of North Africa, this interoperability mattered. Logistics officers could plan on common ammunition scales. Artillery officers could integrate British and American 6-pounders into unified defensive schemes. The gun became a symbol of Allied cooperation, a tangible example of shared industrial capacity. By autumn 1942, the 6-pounder was no longer a scarce resource. It was standard equipment. Infantry divisions received anti-tank regiments equipped with the gun. Tank units began retiring their 2-pounder armed vehicles in favor of 6-pounder variants. Training centers in England and Egypt ran courses on gunnery, maintenance, and tactical employment. The weapon that had been designed in 1939, delayed in 1940, and first deployed in early 1942, was now the backbone of Allied anti-tank defense. Ordnance bulletins from late 1942 documented the scale of production. By the end of the year, over 4,000 6-pounders had been delivered to British forces, with another 1,000 produced in the United States. Ammunition stocks exceeded 10 million rounds. The gun was deployed in every theater where British forces operated: North Africa, the Middle East, India, and the United Kingdom. It equipped British units, Canadian units, Australian units, New Zealand units, South African units, and, through Lend-Lease, Soviet and Free French units. The 6-pounder had become an Allied weapon, produced in multiple countries and used by multiple armies. For the first time, British and American forces fired the same anti-tank round from compatible tubes. Late October and early November, 1942.
El Alamein sector, Western Desert.
A Chevrolet 30 hundredweight lorry reversed toward a 6-pounder position, tailgate down. Infantry platoon members hauled wooden ammunition crates from the truck bed, stacking them in a slit trench beside the gun pit. The gun itself sat low, its barrel pointed west toward Axis lines, range markers already set with wooden pickets driven into the sand. This was the preparation for a set-piece battle, methodical and thorough. The 6-pounder had evolved from an emergency weapon into an integrated component of combined arms doctrine. At El Alamein, the 6-pounder appeared in multiple roles. Towed guns were positioned in forward defensive belts, dug in to present minimal silhouette and sighted to create overlapping fields of fire. Infantry anti-tank platoons controlled these guns, coordinating with rifle companies to establish kill zones. The goal was to channel Axis armor into engagement areas where multiple guns could concentrate fire. British doctrine called this anti-tank artillery in depth, and the 6-pounder's range made the concept effective. Tanks attempting to break through British positions found themselves under fire from 600 yards onward, facing successive belts of guns as they advanced. Tank-mounted 6-pounders provided mobile firepower. Valentine 9 and Churchill 3 tanks, armed with the gun, operated in support of infantry or in independent tank brigades. These vehicles offered protection for the crew and mobility for the weapon, allowing the 6-pounder to maneuver with armored formations. In the fighting at El Alamein, tank-mounted 6-pounders engaged German armor in meeting engagements, fired from hull-down positions to ambush counterattacks, and supported infantry advances by suppressing enemy anti-tank guns. The combination of towed and mobile 6-pounders gave British commanders flexibility. Static defense could transition to mobile counterattack using the same caliber gun. Ammunition logistics reflected the scale of planning. Each towed 6-pounder in the forward line received a basic load of 60 rounds, with an additional 60 rounds per gun held at battery level. Tank guns carried 40 rounds internally, with resupply vehicles positioned to replenish stocks during pauses in combat. Total ammunition expenditure for the battle was tallied in hundreds of thousands of rounds, reflecting both the intensity of fighting and the sustained rates of fire possible with the gun's semi-automatic breech. Supply columns practiced night resupply runs, delivering crates to forward positions under cover of darkness. Field modifications appeared as crews adapted the gun to local conditions. Some units mounted 6-pounders on improvised platforms on lorries, creating mobile anti-tank vehicles for pursuit operations. Others placed guns in specially modified universal carriers, light-tracked vehicles that could maneuver across soft sand. Engineers developed quick-dig techniques for emplacing guns rapidly, using lessons from the Gazala fighting. Battery commanders' logbooks documented these adaptations, noting what worked and what failed, building a body of tactical knowledge that was shared across units. One company commander's note, preserved in a regimental history, captured the gun's reputation by late 1942. The 6-pounder is easier to dig in than to move the men behind it. The line was sardonic, but it reflected the truth. The gun had become so integral to defensive planning that infantry units oriented their positions around it. Where the 6-pounders were aim-placed, the defense was strong. Where they were absent, the defense was vulnerable. Commanders sighted their forces to maximize the gun's fields of fire, using terrain to channel enemy armor into engagement zones. The Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942, and concluded with Axis withdrawal in early November, demonstrated the 6-pounder's maturity as a weapon system. 8th Army's anti-tank guns inflicted significant losses on German and Italian armor, forcing Rommel to commit his reserves piecemeal and ultimately to retreat. The 6-pounder was not solely responsible for the victory. Artillery, air power, armor, and infantry all played roles, but it was a necessary component. British formations could now hold ground under armored assault, exact losses that mattered, and transition from defense to pursuit. The gun that had been needed in 1941 had arrived in time for 1942's decisive battle. By El Alamein, the 6-pounder was both a fixed-belt weapon and a mobile ambush tool. It defended strong points and led pursuits, killed tanks and suppressed guns. It had evolved from a prototype delayed by crisis into a standard weapon employed with confidence. Two functions from one carriage in a war that demanded flexibility. June 1944 through May 1945. Normandy, France. Low Countries, Western Germany. On the morning of June 6, 1944, British and Canadian infantry waded ashore on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. With them came 6-pounders, manhandled off landing craft into the surf, dragged through sand and shingle by crews working under fire. Within hours of the landings, the guns were placed in hedgerows and villages, covering the roads inland. The 6-pounder, proven in the desert, now faced a different war. Close terrain, heavy foliage, and German armor that had grown heavier and more dangerous. By 1944, the Germans had deployed the Panther and Tiger tanks, mounting long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns with frontal armor that exceeded 100mm in thickness. The 6-pounder, lethal against the Panzer III and Panzer IV, struggled against these new adversaries. At typical combat ranges in Normandy, often under 300 yards due to hedgerows and wooded terrain, the 6-pounder could penetrate a Panther's side armor but not its frontal glacis. Against the Tiger, only flank shots offered reasonable prospects of success. British crews learned to position their guns for ambush, targeting the vulnerable sides and rear of German tanks rather than engaging frontally. Despite these limitations, the 6-pounder remained in service throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. Infantry battalions relied on it because it was available in quantity, because crews knew how to employ it, and because in many engagements it remained effective. German forces in Normandy included large numbers of Panzer IV tanks, Stug 3 assault guns, and lighter armored vehicles, all vulnerable to the 6-pounder. The gun also proved valuable in urban fighting, where close ranges and the availability of flank shots made its penetration adequate. In Cannes, Falaise, and the cities of Belgium and Holland, 6-pounders engaged at point-blank range, firing from upper floors or concealed positions at street corners. The introduction of improved ammunition extended the gun's utility. The armor-piercing discarding sabot round, a tungsten core dart that relied on velocity rather than mass for penetration, gave the 6-pounder improved performance against heavy armor. Firing sabot rounds, the gun could penetrate 146mm of armor at 500 yards, enough to defeat a Panther's frontal glacis under favorable conditions. Sabot ammunition was expensive and in limited supply, reserved for engagements against heavy tanks. Standard armor-piercing rounds remained the primary ammunition for most targets. British forces supplemented the 6-pounder with heavier anti-tank guns, the 17-pounder, firing a 76.2mm round, but the 6-pounder remained the standard infantry anti-tank weapon. Logistics, training, and the installed base of guns all favored continued use. By 1944, thousands of 6-pounders were in the field, supported by mature supply chains and trained crews. Replacing them with a heavier gun would have required retraining entire regiments and restructuring logistics at a time when the focus was on maintaining the offensive. The 6-pounder stayed in service, adapted to its new role against heavier opposition. One British infantry officer, reflecting on the Normandy campaign in his post-war memoir, described the 6-pounder as a gun that demanded respect for geometry. Frontal shots against Panthers were discouraged unless no other option existed. Crews were taught to wait for flanking shots, to coordinate with infantry to drive German tanks into kill zones, and to displace rapidly after firing to avoid retaliatory fire. The 6-pounder's low silhouette remained an advantage. In the hedgerows and rubble of France, a well-concealed gun could fire and survive. The margin for error was narrower than in the desert, but the gun remained lethal when employed correctly. By the time Allied forces reached Germany in early 1945, the 6-pounder was nearing the end of its operational life. Newer weapons, the 17-pounder in British service, the 76mm and 90mm guns in American service, were replacing it in frontline units. But the 6-pounder remained in service with second-line formations, garrison troops, and reserve units. It had fought from North Africa to Normandy to the Rhine, and its reputation was secure. A capable, reliable, and lethal weapon that had served when it was needed most. 1942 through 1945. Burma, Malaya, New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands. The 6-pounder reached theaters far from the deserts where it had first proven itself. British, Australian, and New Zealand forces operating against Japanese forces in Southeast Asia and the Pacific received the gun as part of standardized equipment tables. The jungle terrain and the nature of Japanese armor lighter tanks, such as the Type 95 Hago and the Type 97 Chiha, created a different tactical environment than North Africa or Europe. The 6-pounder was, if anything, overcapable against its typical targets in these theaters. Japanese tanks of the early and mid-war period mounted thin armor, rarely exceeding 25 millimeters on the frontal glacis. Against such targets, the 6-pounder was devastating. At ranges under 500 yards, common in jungle fighting, armor-piercing rounds overpenetrated, passing completely through the target and exiting the far side. British crews learned to use high-explosive shells when available, as the blast effect was often more damaging to lightly armored vehicles than solid shot. The 6-pounder's versatility, capable of firing both anti-tank and high-explosive rounds, made it useful in the infantry support role, engaging bunkers, fortified positions, and unarmored vehicles. The gun's weight and size, manageable in open desert terrain, posed challenges in jungle operations. Moving a 6-pounder along narrow trails, across rivers, and through dense vegetation required manpower and ingenuity. Australian and British infantry companies often manhandled guns forward, using timber rollers or improvised sleds. In some cases, guns were broken down into components and carried piece by piece to forward positions. The effort was substantial, but commanders judged the capability worth the cost. A 6-pounder in position could stop a Japanese tank attack or reduce a bunker. Without it, infantry attacks stalled under fire. At the Siege of Impul in 1944, British and Indian forces used 6-pounders in the anti-tank role to defend against Japanese armored thrusts. Japanese Type 97 tanks attempted to break through Allied perimeter defenses, only to be engaged at close range by concealed guns. The results were lopsided. Thin Japanese armor offered no protection against 57mm rounds. Tank after tank was knocked out, often with a single shot. The 6-pounder proved so effective that Japanese commanders largely abandoned armored attacks in favor of infantry infiltration. The gun had shaped enemy tactics by its presence alone. In the Pacific Island campaigns, where American forces predominated, the 6-pounder saw limited use. United States Marine Corps and Army units relied on their own 75mm and 37mm anti-tank guns. However, Australian forces fighting in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands used the 6-pounder extensively. The gun's ability to engage bunkers and fortified positions with high-explosive rounds made it valuable in the grinding attritional warfare of the jungle. Crews positioned guns to fire directly into cave entrances or log-reinforced bunkers, using the flat trajectory to place rounds precisely where they were needed. By 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Japan, the 6-pounder remained in frontline service in Southeast Asia. Plans called for it to be employed in the anti-tank and direct-fire support roles during the landings. The gun's long service life, from 1942 through the end of the war, testified to its reliability and adaptability. It had fought in deserts, in hedgerows, in cities, and in jungles. It had faced German armor, Italian armor, and Japanese armor. It had been mounted on tanks, on lorries, on carriers, and on improvised platforms. It had served in every theater where British and Commonwealth forces operated, and it had earned the respect of the men who served it. One Australian gunner, interviewed decades after the war, recalled his experience with the 6-pounder in New Guinea. "We dragged that bloody gun through mud and jungle for weeks. When we finally got it into position, it fired one shot and knocked out a Japanese tank at 200 yards. After that, none of us complained about the weight anymore." The comment captured the essential truth about the 6-pounder. It was a burden to move and a pleasure to fire. It demanded effort from its crews, and it repaid that effort with performance. 1942 through 1945. Production records, after-action reports, and post-war analyses. The numbers told the story of the six-pounder's impact in cold, measurable terms. Between 1941 and 1945, British and American factories produced approximately 15,400 guns. Of these, the majority were towed anti-tank versions with several thousand tank-mounted variants. Ammunition production exceeded 50 million rounds, a figure that included armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, armor-piercing discarding sabot, high-explosive, and canister natures. The scale of production reflected the gun's status as a standard weapon across Allied forces. Operational reports documented the gun's effectiveness. In North Africa, from first deployment in early 1942 through the end of the campaign in May 1943, six-pounders were credited with destroying or disabling over 1,000 Axis tanks and assault guns. German and Italian after-action reports cited British 57mm guns as a significant threat, responsible for a substantial proportion of armored losses. The precise figures varied by engagement and were subject to the usual uncertainties of combat reporting. But the pattern was consistent. The six-pounder killed tanks. In Northwest Europe, from D-Day through VE Day, the gun remained in widespread use despite the introduction of heavier weapons. British and Canadian anti-tank regiments fired tens of thousands of rounds in combat, engaging German armor in conditions ranging from open farmland to dense urban terrain. The six-pounder's effectiveness declined against late-war German heavy tanks, but it remained lethal against the majority of enemy armored vehicles. Statistical analyses of tank losses showed that lighter German tanks, Panzer IV, Stug III, continued to be vulnerable throughout the war. The six-pounder's longevity reflected this persistent utility. Loss ratios favored the gun. In defensive engagements where six-pounders were properly sighted and supported, British forces consistently achieved favorable exchange rates. Multiple enemy tanks destroyed for each gun lost. This was the fundamental purpose of an anti-tank gun, to impose disproportionate costs on attacking armor. The six-pounder fulfilled this purpose. A towed gun, costing a few £1,000s to manufacture and crewed by 6 men, could destroy a tank costing tens of thousands of pounds and crewed by 4 or 5 highly trained specialists. The arithmetic was stark and, from the defender's perspective, favorable. The impossible statistics, the numbers that strained belief, emerged from production scales and ammunition expenditure. In 1943 alone, British ordnance factories produced over 4,000 six-pounders and approximately 15 million rounds of ammunition. One factory complex, working at full capacity, produced more guns in a month than some smaller belligerent nations fielded in their entire armies. The industrial capacity of Britain and the United States, once fully mobilized, generated war material on a scale that overwhelmed Axis production. The six-pounder was one data point in this larger pattern, but it was a telling one. A single weapon type, produced in thousands, supported by millions of rounds distributed globally. Time paradoxes appeared in the operational tempo. At El Alamein, six-pounders were sometimes firing at rates exceeding 8 rounds per minute for sustained periods, faster than some artillery pieces. A single gun, over the course of a day's fighting, might expend 100 rounds or more. Multiply that by hundreds of guns across the 8th Army, and the daily ammunition consumption reached tens of thousands of rounds. Supply columns worked continuously to keep the guns fed, moving crates from depots to battery positions under blackout conditions. The logistics of sustaining this rate of fire were as impressive as the gunnery itself. Post-war analyses by military historians and ordnance specialists credited the six-pounder with altering the tactical balance in North Africa and contributing to Allied success in Europe and Asia. The gun was not the single decisive weapon of the war, no single weapon was, but it was a necessary component of combined arms success. Infantry supported by capable anti-tank guns could hold ground against armor. Armor operating with mobile anti-tank support could maneuver with confidence. The six-pounder filled a critical gap in Allied capability at a time when that gap might have been fatal. The numbers, accumulated across 4 years of global war, validated the design decisions made in Woolwich in 1939 and the production priorities set in 1941. The 57mm answer had proven correct. 1945 through 1950. Ordnance depots across Britain, surplus yards, and military arsenals. With the end of hostilities in Europe and the Pacific, the six-pounder's active service life drew to a close. Thousands of guns were withdrawn from frontline units and placed in storage. Some were scrapped, their steel recycled into peacetime production. Others were retained in reserve stocks or transferred to allied nations under military aid programs. The gun that had equipped armies in global war now faced the familiar fate of successful weapons. Obsolescence not through failure, but through the passage of time and the development of successors. The British Army's post-war assessment of the six-pounder was measured and professional. Official histories credited the gun with providing effective anti-tank capability during the critical period from 1942 through 1944. The weapon had performed as designed, had been reliable in service, and had been well regarded by crews. Its limitations against late-war heavy tanks were noted but not considered damning. By the time those limitations became significant, heavier weapons were available. The six-pounder had served its purpose and served it well. Successor weapons reflected lessons learned from the six-pounder's service. The British 17-pounder and the American 76mm and 90mm guns applied the same design principles: high velocity, flat trajectory, precision optics, while scaling up to defeat heavier armor. The engineering solutions pioneered in the six-pounder's hydrospring recoil system and semi-automatic breech influenced subsequent designs. In this sense, the six-pounder's legacy was not merely its service record but its contribution to the evolution of anti-tank gunnery. Export and military aid programs extended the gun's service life beyond British forces. Six-pounders were transferred to nations including Greece, Israel, South Africa, and several Latin American countries. In some cases, these guns remained in active service into the 1960s, long after they had been retired from British use. In the Middle East, six-pounders saw combat in the Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1948 and 1956, proving that a weapon designed to fight Panzers in the Western Desert could still kill tanks in a new generation of wars. Museums and military collections preserved examples of the six-pounder for historical study. The Imperial War Museum, the Royal Armories, and the Tank Museum at Bovington all held specimens, along with technical documentation and oral histories from veterans. These artifacts allowed future generations to examine the gun's construction, understand its operation, and appreciate its role in the Allied victory. The physical object, steel, wood, and precision engineering, became a teaching tool, a memorial, and a reminder of the war it had helped to win. Veterans' recollections, collected in the decades after the war, provided personal perspective on the gun's significance. Men who had served six-pounders in North Africa, Normandy, or Burma spoke of the weapon with respect bordering on affection. It had been heavy to move, demanding to maintain, and unforgiving of poor gunnery. But it had also been reliable, accurate, and lethal. When properly employed, it had given its crews a fighting chance against enemy armor. In war, that was enough. One veteran, speaking at a reunion in the 1980s, summarized it simply: "The six-pounder did what we needed it to do when we needed it done. That's all any soldier can ask of his weapon." The post-war assessment was ultimately one of quiet satisfaction. The gun had not been perfect. Its deployment had been delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Its performance against late-war heavy tanks had been marginal. But from early 1942 through late 1944, the six-pounder had been the right weapon at the right time. It had equipped armies, stopped attacks, and saved lives. In the calculus of war, those were the metrics that mattered. 75 years after Gazala. Museums, memorials, and the memories of aging men. A six-pounder stands on display behind velvet rope, its barrel pointed at nothing, its wheels chalked, its breech open to show visitors the mechanism. A placard describes its specifications: 57mm caliber, 2,693 feet per second muzzle velocity, 700 weight in action. The numbers are accurate but abstract. They do not convey the sound of the breech slamming shut, the recoil shock transmitted through the gun shield, or the satisfaction of seeing a target struck at range. Those details belong to the men who served the gun, and each year there are fewer of them to remember. The six-pounder's place in history is secure, though modest. It was not the most powerful gun of the war, nor the most advanced. It did not single-handedly win battles or campaigns, but it was present at critical moments, and its presence mattered. At Gazala, it imposed caution on German commanders who had grown accustomed to tactical supremacy. At El Alamein, it helped anchor a defensive line that held under relentless assault. In Normandy, it gave infantry battalions the means to resist armor in close terrain. In Burma and New Guinea, it provided firepower against targets ranging from tanks to bunkers. It was, in the truest sense, a workhorse weapon, reliable, effective, and ubiquitous. The gun's technical legacy influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development. The principles of high-velocity fire, low silhouette, and mobile employment became standard. Subsequent weapons grew larger and more powerful, but they retained the six-pounder's fundamental approach: defeat armor at range through precision and velocity. The evolution from towed guns to tank-mounted guns to eventually guided missiles followed a logical progression. But the six-pounder represented a key step in that evolution. It demonstrated what was possible when engineering, tactics, and industrial capacity aligned. For the men who served the six-pounder, the gun represented something more personal. It was the tool of their trade, the means by which they fought and survived. Crew members developed intimate familiarity with their gun. The feel of the breech handle, the sight picture through the optic, the rhythm of loading and firing. This familiarity bred confidence, and confidence improved performance. In interviews and memoirs, veterans described the six-pounder not with technical detachment but with the language of partnership. They spoke of their gun as if the weapon were an extension of themselves. In the intense focus of combat, perhaps it was the contrast between expectation and reality, the theme that ran through the six-pounder's entire service life, found its final expression in memory. The gun had been expected in 1941 but did not arrive until 1942. It was expected to struggle against heavy armor but proved adaptable through improved ammunition. It was expected to be replaced quickly by heavier weapons but remained in service through the war's end. Each expectation met a reality shaped by circumstances, decisions, and the friction of war. The six-pounder's story was not one of perfect planning or flawless execution, but of adaptation and perseverance. In the end, the gun's meaning rests not in its specifications or its kill tallies, but in the human outcomes it influenced. Crews who survived because their gun could kill at range. Infantrymen who held ground because anti-tank guns covered their flanks. Commanders who could plan defenses knowing they possessed adequate tools. The six-pounder did not end the war or guarantee victory, but it contributed to both in ways that were measurable and meaningful. It now stands in museums and memorials, a relic of an industrial age's total war, a reminder that technology and human effort, combined, can shape the course of events. The lesson, if there is one, is simple: capability matters. In 1941, British forces lacked the capability to engage German armor on equal terms. By 1942, they possessed that capability, and the course of the Desert War shifted. The six-pounder was not magic, but it was sufficient, and sufficiency, the presence of adequate means applied with competence, is often enough. The gun delivered what it promised: 57 millimeters of answer to a problem that had cost lives and battles. That answer, forged in steel and fired in anger, echoed across 4 years of global conflict and remains visible today, preserved in metal and memory. The six-pounder's final accounting is written in tonnage, casualties, and quiet graves. 15,400 guns produced. 50 million rounds manufactured. Over 1,000 documented tank kills in North Africa alone. Thousands more across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. These numbers represent industry and logistics, but behind each figure stand individuals. The design engineer who calculated barrel stress, the factory worker who machined components, the crew commander who called fire corrections under incoming rounds, the loader who kept the gun fed through hours of engagement. War is often described in grand strategic terms: campaigns, offensives, turning points. But it is also the sum of small tactical actions. A gun crew engaging at 1,000 yards, killing a tank, displacing before counter-battery fire arrives, and repeating the sequence. The six-pounder enabled those actions. It turned tactical problems into tactical solutions. It gave defenders the means to exact costs from attackers. In an attritional war where margins mattered, that was enough. The gun's story is also a story of timing. Too early, and the weapon would have fought a different war, possibly against threats it was not designed to defeat. Too late, and the battles it influenced would have been fought and lost without it. The 6-pounder arrived when it was needed most, deployed in numbers sufficient to make a difference, and served until heavier weapons made it redundant. That timing was not entirely fortunate. It resulted from decisions made under crisis, production scaled through effort, and logistics executed under fire. But the result, a capable weapon in the right place at the right time, shaped outcomes in ways that ripple through history. To stand before a preserved 6-pounder today is to see an object that bridges past and present. The gun is inert now, its breech locked open, its bore cleaned and preserved. But the mechanism remains, waiting. The sight still swivels. The traverse still turns. The engineering is still sound. If ammunition were available and a crew trained, the gun could fire. That potential, frozen in museum preservation, is a reminder that weapons are not simply artifacts. They are tools designed for specific purposes, and understanding those purposes requires understanding the context in which they were employed. The men who served the 6-pounder are nearly gone now. Each year, fewer veterans remain to describe the weight of the breech block, the sound of the firing pin striking the primer, the satisfaction of a solid hit. Their memories, preserved in interviews and oral histories, provide texture that statistics cannot. They remind us that war is experienced individually, one gun crew at a time, and that collective outcomes emerge from countless individual actions. The 6-pounder's contribution to victory was the aggregation of those individual actions. Each round fired, each target engaged, each crew that held its position when armor advanced. History judges weapons by their impact, and the 6-pounder's impact is clear. It altered the tactical balance in North Africa, provided effective anti-tank defense in Europe and Asia, and served with distinction across 4 years of global conflict. It was not a perfect weapon, no weapon is, but it was an effective one, well-suited to its era and well-used by the forces that employed it. Its legacy is visible in the arsenals that followed, in the museums that preserve it, and in the histories that record its service. The final word belongs to the veterans, whose judgment carries weight earned through experience. They did not glorify the 6-pounder or romanticize its service. They described it in practical terms. Heavy, reliable, accurate, lethal. They spoke of it as professionals speak of tools, with respect for what it could do and awareness of its limits. That sober assessment, grounded in combat experience, is the truest measure of any weapon's worth. The 6-pounder did its job. It fought where it was needed, killed what it was aimed at, and gave its crews a chance to survive. In the arithmetic of war, that balance, lethality and survivability, effect and cost, is the equation that matters. The 57mm answer proved correct. The question had been how to fight enemy armor at range and survive the engagement. The answer, forged in Woolwich and proven at Gazala, was the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun. 700 weight of steel, engineered to fire 1 round every 6 seconds, at 2,693 feet per second, with enough energy to penetrate 74mm of armor at 1,000 yards. Those specifications, translated into practice by trained crews, changed the course of battles and campaigns. That is the gun's memorial, written not in bronze but in historical record. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.